So our reserves were 7.6 billion at the end of 2019. They fell to about 5.6, I'm giving you approximate numbers, in end of 2020. And they were down to 1.6 at the end of 2021. So you can see there's an exponential decline now. The moment we couldn't reborrow, but we continued to pay, the reserves kept plummeting down. As the reserves come down, and that's what the rating agencies also look at, the ability, the liquidity to pay in the future, the ratings also kept coming down. So we are now caught in a vicious cycle.
Do you think Sri Lanka should approach the IMF?
So I think for Sri Lanka to approach the IMF today, there are two reasons why we can't do that. One is we don't have a plan. And it would make no sense to ask the IMF for a plan. Okay. Secondly, no bank wants to bail out your current debt holders. So if I am continuing to pay the debt to my current bank and I ask a second bank to fund me, they will be worried that I'll take their money, pay the existing bank, and they'll be left holding the can of my inability.
It has been reported that the government is reluctant to approach the IMF because the IMF lays out strict conditions. What are these conditions? Welcome everyone, you're watching Conversations. Sri Lanka is faced with a major economic crisis, one that economists say is possibly the worst in its recent history. There are restrictions on imports that have impacted many people and businesses. There are severe food shortages. Essential food items are not available or prices have risen to an extent that many are finding it difficult to afford. Today, I will be in conversation with the Executive Director of Verity Research, Dr. de Mel. Verity Research, for those of you who are not aware, is an independent think tank that provides strategic analysis for Asia in the areas of economics, politics, law, and media. Welcome, Dr. de Mel.
Thank you, Alanki.
Thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me. I do believe that this is a conversation that we must have given the current crisis that we face as a nation. To start things off with, international rating agencies such as Fitch and Moody's have downgraded Sri Lanka. And just last week, S&P further downgraded Sri Lanka while it was on the verge of repaying its $500 million sovereign bond. Now, the governor of the central bank, Ajit Niwad Cabral, says that these ratings do not really reflect the real situation in Sri Lanka. How accurate are these ratings?
So global rating agencies like the ones you mentioned, Alanki, Fitch, S&P, Moody's, they follow a standard methodology and template in doing their ratings, and they issue a ratings report explaining exactly how they have rated a country, what information and data they have used, and it is an analytical document that is available for everyone to see. So I think if one feels that the rating is inaccurate or inappropriate, one can quite easily check that, because we can compare the way they've rated Sri Lanka against the way they have rated other countries and see whether there are any inconsistencies. And we can look at the data that they have used in rating Sri Lanka and see whether there are any factual errors. But I think I have not seen either the central bank or the governor or anyone else provide actually a analytical response to the rating agencies to say that it is not fair or it is wrong. But the claim of unfairness, I think, has been made. Okay, I think, there is a famous Latin maxim, I can't quite remember it, nemo judex in sua causa, which means one should not be the judge in one's own case. So I think in this case, when you say all the rating agencies, right, that is S&P, Moody's, Fitch, have downgraded Sri Lanka, and they've done that repeatedly, it's like, if the first umpire, the second umpire, and the third umpire all say you're out, I mean, if the batsman sits there and insists he's not out, it's just not cricket, right? So I think you've got to accept the judgment, especially when you can't present an analytical explanation of why you would disagree with the rating outcome.
Dr. de Mel, are we on the verge of bankruptcy? Are we going to default?
So before I come to that, can I say a little more about the rating actually, given that we are on that? I am sympathetic though to the central bank's concern that the debt is being paid regularly and we are still being downgraded, right? I think that concern or that sense of unfairness or injustice comes from a misunderstanding of how the ratings are actually done. With an individual, the bank may look at your history of payments. With a rating agency, they're not looking in the rear view mirror and trying to figure out what you did last year or 5 years ago. They're really looking forward through the windscreen. They're saying, what is the country capable of doing in the future? What the rating agencies are doing is really giving information to potential lenders to say, is this country a credit risk or not? And that's a future-facing assessment, not a past-facing assessment. So every time Sri Lanka repays bondholders, because Sri Lanka's problem is this, that we have lost access to international credit markets. That happened, when our credit ratings went down last year. And every time we repay the debt, our reserves, that is the money that you have in dollars in the central bank, keep going down and down and down. So every time your reserves go down, you're more at risk of not being able to pay debts in the future.
Right.
So this is why you will see that rating agencies seem to downgrade us soon after we pay the debt or just when it is clear we are about to pay debt. Because it is the moment they know that reserves are going to go down some more, they assess us correctly as a greater credit risk for the future. So I understand, I think if you think of it, if you don't understand the technology or the technique behind the rating, you may say it's so unfair, I have such an unblemished record. But if you understand that this is not about your history, it is about your future, and it's an analytical assessment of what you're able to do, then the ratings make a lot of sense. I'm sorry that I diverted you from your second question. Yeah.
That's fine. But yes, as I was asking you, is Sri Lanka on the verge of bankruptcy? Are we going to default?
So thank you for that question, because I want to make a distinction between default and bankruptcy. Okay, I said earlier that our reserves have been going down every time we made a payment.
Right.
Okay, the reason the reserves are going down is, unlike in the past when our ratings were higher, we can't actually go to international financial markets and say, please lend us something. So as long as your payment of debt is sort of also met by new borrowing, there's a kind of equilibrium created. So you're borrowing some that replenishes your reserves, you're paying back old debt. So the debt is getting rolled over. Now, when you can't roll over the debt, every time you repay debt, you are going to have your reserves decline. And you're getting closer and closer to the point where you don't have enough reserves to pay for essential things. Like, I think we've heard the Minister of Petroleum say $200 million are missing to pay for oil. And then we've heard that there are power cuts because you can't import the oil to run the power station. You've seen people say that pharmaceuticals are in short supply, that milk foods are in short supply, that foodstuffs are in short supply. All of this is because the central bank is holding on to those reserves because it's collecting them to repay the debt. So really, what is bankruptcy is when a country doesn't have reserves left to meet its immediate needs, to meet its oil needs, its food needs, its pharmaceutical needs. So that is what bankruptcy is. Default is when you decide to delay a debt payment unilaterally by over 30 days. Okay, so really think of it as a business. I mean, I know you probably come from a business background. When your company is in trouble, and it happened during COVID, you can't pay your workers, you can't buy stuff to do your manufacturing. You sometimes go to the bank and say, look, I have to stop paying you. I'm going to withhold payment, but give me time, because when my business is back up and running, I will be able to repay you. So you may have to default technically with the bank, but it is to avoid bankruptcy that you do that. right? Whereas if you kept paying the bank and you couldn't pay your workers and you couldn't supply your business, then your business actually then goes bankrupt. So default and bankruptcy are two different things. Sri Lanka today has all the signs, emerging signs of bankruptcy. It's a continuum. As we hold on to these dollars and don't release it for the essential needs of the economy, that's what bankruptcy looks like. And the more we restrict dollars from the local economy, the more we get to looking like we are bankrupt. But if we took those 500 million and we were able to actually give it for purchases locally, and we didn't have to pay the debt, we defaulted in a way. And really, default here would be suspending debt payments. So it's not that you'll never pay them back. You negotiate something where you say, look, I can't pay you back on time, but I will pay you back later. But doing that is a way to, in this instance, avoid bankruptcy. So in a sense, you can't have the cake and eat it when you're in this situation, right? So you've got to choose. Am I going to delay debt payments, or am I going to delay bankruptcy, right? Or even avoid bankruptcy? And I think that is the serious choice that Sri Lanka needed to and has to make at this time, whether we give priority to building the economy, keeping the economy running, or whether we give priority to paying debt holders on time. So I hope that's clear.
Indeed, that was a very clear differentiation.
That avoiding a path through default or debt suspension may help us avoid bankruptcy. But if the reserves keep going down, because 500 million is rather a lot, our reserves are down to just under 1 month. Usable reserves, I mean, okay? So there are some accounting things that are done, but usable reserves are down to under 1 month of imports. And that's about 1.5 billion today. Now, 500 million that was recently due is actually 1/3 of that. So if 1/3 of that flies out the door, right, to meet debt payments, suddenly you are in a much more critical situation. And I think the S&P downgrade may have been in anticipation of that problem. Now, I remember also last week there was news that the central bank was releasing $5 million to clear goods stuck in the port because people couldn't access dollars. So you can, I mean, it's quite stark, right? That the goods are stuck in the port for want of $5 million, and we have $500 million waiting to go out to debt holders. So in a sense, but central bank decided in their kindness to offer a peanut to the Sri Lankan economy, while it was offering, the whole, 500 million out to debt holders on time. So I think that is a choice that has to be made quite wisely, because if the economy gets into deeper trouble, then anyway, the chance of repaying the debt is shot in the future.
And many say that this was a long time in the making. Is this true?
So I think, nobody's ever published an analysis that says it's a long time in the making, and we have to ask what it is. I mean, having debt itself is not the problem. So I think most people misunderstand the problem of having debt. But debt is something that almost all countries have, and extremely successful and rich countries like the UK, the United States, have very high levels of debt to GDP, not too far away from where Sri Lanka was, or in similar straits in 2019, let's say. Japan, in fact, has a 250% debt to GDP. Sri Lanka is only about 110% or 120%, right, in that range. So really, I think there may be a misunderstanding that the problem is due to having debt. The problem is not due to having debt. The problem is due to two other things. One is part of Sri Lanka's problem is the cost of debt. We take debt at a very high price. And also, we don't have a lot of government revenue compared to our peers, that is, right? So for instance, in 2021, we projected that Sri Lanka's debt service payments, that is interest payments as a percentage of government revenue, was at 70%. Okay, that's about 6% of GDP. So you remember the time when they said 6% of GDP for education, and everybody said that's too much, we can't afford it. We pay more than 6% of GDP on interest alone on our debt. But it's also 70% of revenue, because Sri Lanka's government revenue is so little. And actually, the critical downgrade, so all this time that wasn't really biting us because our ratings were such that we could go to international financial markets and borrow when we repaid. And we kept rolling it over in a certain fashion. But what happened at the end of 2019 was that we did some very deep tax cuts. Effectively, it cut government revenue by 25%. That is the tax cuts alone. I'm talking about the non-COVID impact of the tax cuts. We contracted our tax base by 33%. That's the number of taxpayers, VAT and income tax, reduced by 33%. And the projected tax revenue reduced by 25%, and rating agencies caught on to that because one of the metrics is the government's revenue, which is the ability to repay its debt. So we had a downgrade around April, May 2020, and that was the critical downgrade. That basically shut us off from international markets. So people talk about being blacklisted and all that. There's no such thing in the international lingo. What happens is you get downgraded in your ratings. So the blacklisting downgrade, as it were, already happened, right? It's not something that's waiting to happen when we default. The critical downgrade already took place when Sri Lanka could no longer access international markets. So when the president says we haven't borrowed internationally, now that's not accurate factually. We borrowed from China, from Japan, from the United States, or different places. And we've certainly got money from the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and all that. But I think he means that we did not take international sovereign bonds or from the international financial market. That's because we couldn't. The downgrade basically shut us off. Okay, and that is what has caused today's critical problem, because that shutting off the tap from the international financial markets meant as we continue to pay, our reserves keep plummeting down. So our reserves were 7.6 billion at the end of 2019. They fell to about 5.6, I'm giving you approximate numbers, in end of 2020. And they were down to 1.6 at the end of 2021. So you can see there's an exponential decline now on the reserves.
So it did have a negative impact on the
economy. The moment we couldn't reborrow, but we continued to pay, the reserves kept plummeting down. As the reserves come down, and that's what the rating agencies also look at, the ability, the liquidity to pay in the future, the ratings also kept coming down. So we are now caught in a vicious cycle of reserve decline, rating downgrade, reserve decline. And the only way to break that cycle would really be to suspend payments, avoid bankruptcy, and we can talk more about that later. Yeah.
All right. Moving on to the next question. The Finance Minister, Basil Rajapaksa, announced around $1 billion package for economic relief. That includes a special allowance for government employees. Is this useful? I mean, does this help in the long run?
Well, I think, we've had quite a lot of price increases recently. And you must sympathize with the fact that people find life difficult. Right. COVID also has impacted jobs and incomes. And so I think whenever there is inflation and price increase, it is good to see how you can support people. But I think it's also quite important to understand who you're supporting, and to whatever money you're putting into support, target it to the most vulnerable.
Right.
In a way, the targeting, I think, may be problematic. Maybe the intention was right, but maybe the method was problematic for this reason. That, first of all, it is to all government servants, regardless of income level. So there are government servants who may be earning over 100,000. There may be government servants who are earning less than 40,000. I think, you don't need to give everyone the equal support. You may want to spread it to the lower income bracket. Secondly, if you think about COVID lockdowns, government servants were the most secure. They didn't lose their jobs. They continued to get their incomes, whether they worked or not. And I think it may have been also prudent to target the assistance to those who are most vulnerable, which are daily wage earners. So there are ways to actually find them, because we have extremely good local government system that goes down to the Grama Sevaka. And I think the intention to support the welfare of people is positive, but it may not have been the right targeting of those incentives, both within government and the fact that those outside government that are most vulnerable, self-employed, daily wage workers, that didn't get the targeted assistance that they so badly need.
All right. Another question that many have is printing money or printing money excessively. How does this impact the economy?
Yeah. So I've seen a lot of criticism that says, government is printing money excessively. And certainly during the COVID period, the central bank did increase direct funding of government debt. So that's what you call printing money, right? The government doesn't go to the public or to the market and take more debt, but the central bank takes on government debt directly and, in a sense, invents money to pay the government. So that invention of the creation of money that wasn't in circulation by the central bank to fund the government deficit is what you call printing money. Now, I think in a time of a downturn, where people are, in a sense, there's less liquidity in the market. People aren't spending, people are fearful, people aren't earning. It is not unusual for central banks to increase the money supply through such a mechanism. And it increased rather a lot. But I think what we've also seen is that the central bank, with time, has tapered off that increase. So it hasn't been growing it exponentially. It grew it rather fast and has been tapering it off and maintaining, some level of support for government. And the price increases we see, as the central bank claims, is also due to supply side shocks. So we know that for various policy reasons, agriculture production has fallen. Because people were physically unable to go to work, production has fallen in lots of other sectors of the economy. There has been an increase in global oil prices, and that has resulted in increasing the price at the pump. The rupee also has been depreciating, and even though the formal rate is 200, the informal rate is much higher. So people are spending more to import. So all these are also drivers, I think, of the current price increases you see. And I think I am sympathetic to the central bank's position that inflation today is driven by those what you call supply side factors, not because they put too much money in the hands of people. Right? And I think, so we must look at that, I think, prudently. And perhaps, it may not be reasonable to think that the central bank is responsible for the inflation right now. The way they're managing it, I think, is reasonable currently.
And my next question is something you've probably been asked many times. Do you think Sri Lanka should approach the IMF?
So I think I do hear this a lot, that there's this idea that the way out of all your problems is to go to the IMF. The IMF is like another bank. So you're in debt to certain banks and you choose to ask another bank for assistance, right? But except the IMF is a little different from a commercial bank. It's more like a development bank. Now, whenever you go to a bank, they say, look, we can support you, right? However, we will need to see a business plan. So Sri Lanka can go to the IMF and ask for some assistance, but it would need to produce a business plan. Now, when they ask you that question, you don't ask the credit officer at the bank, why don't you just write a business plan that your board will be happy with and put it in and get my loan approved? And if you do that, and then after your loan is approved, you look at that business plan and say, I can't implement this is crazy, then it's probably your fault, right? But actually, the method is for Sri Lanka to have a plan, not for the IMF to offer you a plan, and to actually get that, have a plan and then make the case that it deserves help because it has a plan, right? So I think for Sri Lanka to approach the IMF today, there are two reasons why we can't do that. One is we don't have a plan, and it would make no sense to ask the IMF for a plan, okay? Secondly, no bank wants to bail out your current debt holders. So if I am continuing to pay the debt to my current bank and I ask a second bank to fund me, they will be worried that I'll take their money, pay the existing bank, and they'll be left holding the can of my inability to pay. So one of the things the IMF will ask, and anyone will ask, is say, look, unless you suspend your debt payments, we are not going to support you. We can help you build your business, but we can't help you bail out your current creditors. They will have to wait while we help you grow your business. Now, they may not help you because you've told them to wait, but a third party coming in to assist you, including the IMF, will want you to suspend debt payments in order to get that assistance. So Sri Lanka has, first needs to suspend debt payments and needs to have a plan, I think, if it is to reasonably ask the IMF for assistance.
It has been reported that the government is reluctant to approach the IMF because the IMF lays out strict conditions. What are these conditions?
So, as I said earlier, this is a misunderstanding. It comes from this habit or approach of telling the credit officer to write your plan. And the credit officer writes a plan, and that's interpreted as conditions. Okay, but actually the UK, the US, lots of developed countries go to the IMF, they write their plan. It is only in underdeveloped countries where their institutions' capacity is poor that you end up with this idea that you have conditions because it's not you who wrote your plan. But the IMF never gives you a document of conditions. In fact, the government gives IMF what's called the letter of intent. We call it the LOI. So it's the government submits a plan to the IMF, and it's in public view. It's public even in 2009 and 2015, 16. We were with the IMF program, and you can go and see that it is a letter written by the government, signed by the Secretary to the Treasury, by the central or the Minister of Finance, by the central bank governor, that says, here is our plan. Here is what we intend to do. Here is when we hope to complete these activities. And here's how we are going to progress and succeed. So really, I think what you see is that Sri Lanka did that in 2009 under the current governor of the central bank very successfully. You can see that in 2010, 11, 12, Sri Lanka had high growth rates while being on a plan that Sri Lanka had submitted to the IMF. And actually, when the program finished in 13, you saw actually growth rates were much lower in 13, and they picked up a bit in 14, stayed about the same in 15. So this idea that being in an IMF program is detrimental or it has conditions, I think kind of popular misunderstandings, partly driven by IMF's history. So if you reverse 25 years, yes, the IMF was in the business of setting conditions. But that's no longer the case, how the IMF works, right? So I think many people have memories from what it was like 25 to 50, 45 years ago when the IMF was writing plans and setting conditions. But that has changed a long time ago. And that's not how it works. Currently, Sri Lanka must come up with the plan and come up with a plan that can win the confidence of analysts and is implementable. And we've done that even in 2009 to 12, even in 2016 and 17. And I think we can do that again.
So should Sri Lanka be depreciating its currency to solve this problem?
Again, I think many people have thought about currency depreciation as a way, simply for this reason, right? That because there's a shortage of dollars in the market, and there's a shortage because the central bank is hoarding dollars to their debt holders and not providing the dollars to the Sri Lankan economy, those who need dollars are willing to pay something above the official rate. So the official rate is 200, and they're willing to pay 220, 230, 240, 250. I mean, say somebody wants to send their son abroad for education and they need dollars, they might be willing to pay quite a lot to get those dollars because there is a shortage. So really, and because now there is an alternative informal price in the market, worker remittances, workers who earn outside the country, send their money to Sri Lanka, get only 200, and now this special incentive 210 from the central bank. They rightfully say, well, why can't we get that 230, 240 price? And so they send it through the informal channels as well, and not through the formal banking system. Okay. As a result, central bank reserves go down further because central bank doesn't see those coming into the system, right? And that is part of what the DS, reduction in reserves is about. So this is again another vicious cycle. But it's probably a mistake to think that you can simply solve the problem by depreciating the currency, because if the central bank says tomorrow, okay, we're going to pay 240 for the dollar, you still have a shortage. So if the central bank is unwilling to release dollars into the market as the market requires, then whenever there's a shortage, the informal price is going to be higher than the formal price. So it doesn't matter what price the central bank sets formally, the informal market price is going to be high as long as there's a shortage. We know that well. If there's a food shortage, it doesn't matter what the price in the shop is. As long as there's a shortage at that price, there will be demand to pay a higher price, right? And so I think, it's important first to take the shortage out. And the best way to take the shortage out is to stop losing dollars for debt servicing, as we do now. We take 500 million out, and we were short of 5 million for our ports, right? Can you imagine that? So, and we are short of 200 million to just bring electricity to the country and supply the power stations. So it is important to solve the shortage problem. And along with that, you may still need a little bit of depreciation to balance it out. But depreciation probably should not be seen as a single instrument by which you can solve the problem, right? It is an accompanying instrument to other actions that you take to stop the shortage of dollars and make sure that central bank can supply dollars to the market at the same price that it is willing to buy.
Everyone talks about the economic crisis and the issues faced by Sri Lanka as a nation. But my question to you is, what is the solution? What is the way forward?
Yes, so I think there's a very simple, obvious way forward for Sri Lanka right now. I've told you that avoiding bankruptcy is the critical issue. Because in trying to sustain your debt payments, if you run your business into bankruptcy, then there is no way out for you. You are then genuinely bankrupt. So Sri Lanka must avoid bankruptcy at all costs, and avoiding bankruptcy is keeping enough dollars in reserves. Mm-hmm. And because we are locked out of international financial markets, the only way to keep dollars in reserves or to prevent their fast depletion is to suspend the payment of debt. So you have to announce a suspension of debt payment. You could say, look, I'll continue to service interest. And at the end of a renegotiation, so when you suspend, you don't just say, get lost, I'm not paying. You say, I'd like to renegotiate the debt payments. And what you do is you commit that at the end of a renegotiation process, I will pay you whatever we agree. It's a mutual agreed renegotiation finally, okay? And I will pay you interest until that process is over. And that is what most countries do when they get to this point. I mean, Ecuador, Argentina, Jamaica, Ukraine. There's so many countries in the last few years that had to do this process. And, Ecuador and Argentina finished their restructuring conversations within 6 months, Argentina within 4 months, and came out of the problem. The moment you do that, you've done two things to help yourself. You've preserved your reserves, so your ratings go down the moment you announce that, because if effectively that's considered a restrictive default, you go to RD. But you're already in the blacklist, so it doesn't change your situation much, right? But the moment you finish the negotiations, the ratings tend to come back up. Your access to markets tends to come back. And so that is really, the current path is just going on a continuum of getting closer to zero on reserves. By zero, I mean then the only reserves you have are what you earn through exports, which is not enough. It doesn't even meet half your needs, right? And so the current, and then lower and lower ratings, which you're inexorably getting to, which you need to reverse. The second reason to stop the debt payments, pause the debt payments, is the other reason I told you. Not even the IMF or any other distress fund will assist you to bail out your current debt holders. Wall Street, they're not there to bail out Wall Street.
Right.
Okay. So when you suspend the debt payments and announce a restructuring conversation, there are other funds available to assist you, including from the IMF, but not just the IMF. Right, that then, because they now know that their debt has greater, their debt has to be paid back first, so they'll set conditions to that you have to pay them before you pay your existing debt holders, right? You call it seniority. So their debt will be senior, and that gives them confidence. But if you take their debt and settle current debt holders, then they are in trouble. So actually the reason to suspend debt payments is both those reasons, that you suddenly get access to others that can assist you, you slow down the path to bankruptcy, and actually maybe there's a third reason, you speed up the path to recovery, right? Where you can get your reserves back up with assistance, You can get your ratings back up when your restructuring conversation is over. If you do it well, you can do it within 6 months. And your economy has then a positive way forward. So I think that is the very simple, very obvious way for Sri Lanka moving forward.
All right. We have come to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. de Mel. I'm sure our viewers found it to be very informative and very insightful. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Dr. de Mel, once again.
Thank you, Alanki.
I will be back with another episode soon. Until then, stay safe and take care.